Hi everyone, Katie here from the Museum of Ontario Archaeology again, and this morning, we are talking about what rots or what will decompose in the ground and what won't, or under what conditions, because these are all a little bit different. And so I'm going to go through a bunch of different materials, and then I have an experiment for us to do at the end. So first off, we looked up artifacts last week, I think, in one of the live talks. And there are a few types of materials that we find here in the ground. Those are stone, and I'm going to start with stone because stone or rock can be made into axes like this one here. It can be made into arrowheads, or a projectile point like this one. It's a fairly small one. Now, stone will not rot. It will last forever. However, sometimes there are some types of stone, limestone for instance, that in the right conditions can get really crumbly and not very strong. And that material, that rock, for an archaeologist, it's not that useful because it kind of crumbles and falls apart. But most stone and most types of rock, they are very sturdy and they will last for a very long time. So we find stone everything all over the world because in most instances it doesn't rot away. We have wood. This is a wooden stick. Wood here in Ontario, the Museum of Ontario Archaeology is in Ontario, and Ontario has a very temperate climate. So sometimes it's hot and sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's all those things in one day. So here our climate, wood rots away in 1 to 3 years is most conditions. So that's every little bit of it will rot away. There's a few spots, a few instances where that might change here in Ontario, but for the most part, wood will rot away very, very quickly. However, if you're in an environment like a desert, where it is dry all the time, or underwater, which is one of the only places, all of the Great Lakes are full of sunken shipwrecks. Many of them are from a few hundred years ago when they were made out of wood, and those still survive in the water. And if you bring them up out of the water, they will start to crumble and sort of disintegrate away. But mostly you need a desert, or sometimes like a peat bog, where it's going to keep oxygen from getting to the wood and the bacteria that would eat it. So wood normally rots away. So here we have it's actually a drill, and this is all a replica made by one of the friends of the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, Darcy, who is a flint knapper, and he made this drill bit for me. So this piece also has some string. Now both the wood and the string, which is actually sinew, sinew is made from the tendons, which attaches the muscles to bones from animals, and both of these would rot away very, very quickly, but the stone drill bit would last forever in the ground. So we only find this part. So what else do we have? We have pottery. Pottery is another thing. It's almost kind of a man-made stone because of the way it's baked and fired and cooked, and it makes it very, very stable, and it doesn't really even change much when it's buried in the ground for thousands of years. So this piece here is probably about 500 or 600 years old. We looked at this the other day when we were making our pottery. We copied its pattern. This is a new piece of pottery. This is a older piece of pottery, an indigenous 500-year-old piece of pottery. Both of these will survive buried in the ground for a very, very long time. Now the paint that I used on here probably won't. It'll all sort of disintegrate and decompose off. It's acrylic paint though, which is a plastic. And we talk about plastics sitting out in their landfills and in our oceans for many, many hundreds of years, and they will, but they will eventually rot. A plastic hair clip that I had yesterday, if this was buried outside in the ground, it would stay there, and over time, over hundreds of years, it would get brittle, and it would get crumbly, and it would be very weak. You could bend it and break it apart, and then after about 450 years, it would disappear. So the plastics that we have, plastic artifacts that we find, they will eventually rot as well. Just it takes a very long time. It's about 400 plus years. So that's plastics. Bone. Now I've showed you some bones here. This is a bone sewing needle or an awl made from a long bone of an animal. We have a little bead made out of a deer toe, a toe bone, phalange. Now bones are interesting because a lot of different things can happen to bones. So these bones were buried in the ground for probably 500-600 years, and they're in pretty good condition. They haven't rotted away too much at all. Okay, these are pretty good. If bones are burnt, they can get very crumbly, but it can also preserve them, depending on the situation. Bones will rot generally in the ground here in Ontario. In our conditions, after about 1,000 years or so, they will have disappeared. In the right conditions, or the wrong conditions, depending on how you're looking at it, these bones can rot away in as little as a year, depending on the acidity in the soil and all the different conditions that are there. But they can also last for much, much longer. So it really depends on where they're buried. And if we find a fossil of a bone, that means it was buried in a place where it had lots of pressure and compression on it that turned it into a fossil. And once it's a fossil, which takes a very long time to make, so none of the more recent history here in Ontario, so the last few thousand years, will we find fossils from. But fossils are stone, and as we know, stone doesn't rot at all. So those are the bones that we have. Now a lot of the items, we talked about making our baskets last week. Baskets are made out of plant material. Plant material rots away in as little as a few weeks to a few months, depending on where it is, but it's not going to last very long. So our stuffed animal would rot away, all of it, in a few months' time. Our baskets would rot away, with very little exception. Here in Ontario, sometimes these organic materials like fabrics, the basketry, they can survive in very, very, very dry or very, very wet, unchanging conditions. So sometimes, very rarely here though in Ontario. I also have some metals for us. I have a pair of tweezers that are made out of metal, and I have a coin that we talked about yesterday. It's made out of metal. Coins and anything metal has a very long life in the ground, but it will eventually corrode, and it'll start to sort of oxidize, which means that oxygen is eating away or changing the metal's physical thing. And so it eventually becomes sort of a clump of metal, and over time it will kind of cease to be the thing it used to be. So metals, they have a very, very, very long life, but they will sort of disintegrate almost. And what happens to them as well is they rub down and they lose the surface. So our very shallowly printed coins that we have now would end up being very flat metal pieces. which makes them hard to read. Hard to read that 2008 date that is on that coin. Now I have for us glass. I have one more thing we're gonna do an experiment with. So I'll talk about glass first. So this is a little tiny glass bowl. It's made for sampling tea, actually. Now glass will last forever. It will not break down. It's a little bit like our pottery in the way that it's made. It's created from melted sand, essentially, is how you make glass. And glass, though it won't break down and it won't rot away, it will become metallic, and will have this very metallic-y shine to it. And we can use that, archaeologists can study how much it's metallic, how it's changing, to determine how old it is. So we can use that change to the glass to tell its date, to tell how old it's and how long it's been sitting in the ground. All right, the last thing I have for us is some food. So food will rot away in no time at all, generally. It takes a few days, a few weeks for organic materials like foods to rot away. So I have an experiment for us. I have an apple piece. So this is just a regular slice of apple. And I'm gonna put, I don't have it quite up there yet, it should be up in the next half hour or so, onto our resource page on our website with a observational chart for you to fill out if you want to do this. We have a little piece of apple, and we're going to do some experiments with these little pieces of apple. So if we let this is the fresh apple, just cut from an apple today, a few minutes ago. How will this change in different conditions? So if you just leave it out, it dries in my apartment here because it's fairly warm. So this is kind of the dried apple piece. Now, I don't have any soil. One of the things I'm going to tell you to do on the observation chart in this experiment is to put it in soil and see what happens. Hard to get soil at this point in time, but that would be one. And the other is to try to preserve it a little bit. So I don't have the salt that I used the other day. So I put a little piece of apple in some sugar. And sugar works similarly to salt to preserve things. But salt will work a little bit better. So here we have, this is the piece of apple that was in sugar. And this is the piece of apple that was just sitting out in the regular air. So you can see that this piece of apple hasn't dried up and started to rot away quite as much as this one. And if we had salt, it would probably be even a little bit better. But you can test that out. So the chart that I have on the website is going to have four categories. 1, leave it out in the air. 2, bury it in some dirt. You can put it in a pot, in some potting soil, or you can put it outside. If you have a garden outside of a house, then you can do that too. Or if you have a planter, you can put it in the planter. Put in some salt and put in some sugar. And in a week, go back and take a look and see how each of them has changed from what they were to begin with. And if you want to continue, you can do another week and then go back and see how they've changed. These two pieces here are about a week. So you can see how they started off like this. It's shriveled up a little bit. And this is the essentially dried piece here. So if you have any questions, please let us know and have some fun with your experimentation. We'll see you this afternoon at 1 p.m. Heather is going to be talking about the Who Cares About the Past exhibit that is up at the museum, even though we're not open. So she'll be talking about that today, and that is essentially how archaeology works here in Ontario. It's talking about cultural resource management, which is the commercial type of archaeology. So if you're interested in that, take a look. And I will see you tomorrow morning. We are making a craft tomorrow. We're also doing some science. So We're going to be making some sort of plastic keychains. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.